John Walter Christie, or oftentimes referred to as simply J. Walter Christie or Walter Christie, was born on May 6, 1865 in New Milford, New Jersey. He was the second born of four children, Civil War baby being born 3 days before the war was over. His father was named Jacob Briggerhoff and his mother Elizabeth Van Houten Christie. From here till the end, we are going to refer to J. Walker Christie as just Christie. Christie was mechanically inclined from a young age. He spent most of his youth working as a machinist and was fascinated by mechanics. When Christie was 16 years old, he would get a job working at Delamator Iron Works, which was the same place that built the Civil War ironclads, which were protective armor that went on the side of ship hulls. Both sides used different forms of iron cladding. The ironworks that Christie was employed at made the ironclad for the USS Monitor. Christie also attended classes at Cooper Union in New York City while working at the ironworks. In 1899, Christie would open up his own ironworks company, which focused on building and refurbishing gun turret tracks, as well as building various submarine designs for the United States Navy. In the early 1900s, Christie began to obsess about this newfangled contraption called the automobile. While most everyone else was making primitive horseless carriages, Christie took a completely different approach in both style and just look at that vehicle. It looks so robust, like an actual car with a completely different outside-the-box engine and drivetrain configuration. Christie would patent front-wheel drive design in 1904, which also covered the engine being transversely mounted, independent sliding pillar front suspension. His design was direct drive to the front wheels, and because it was direct drive, the engine output didn't suffer the 20% power loss by going through a transmission, but it did come with a different drawback. The engine RPM was limited, which is why he needed an engine with a huge displacement. Christie's first automobile design came in 1903. He built and designed not only the chassis, but the engine and transmission, and instead of the power going to the rear wheels, it went to the front wheels, opting for a four-cylinder engine. The front axle doubled as the engine crankcase, as well as it also housed the transmission, and it was the front axle. The cylinder block was on top of the crankcase. It featured a low gear and reverse, which provided 5-to-1 reduction, which made it possible for the drive wheels to slip relative to each other. But when it was driven at normal speeds, the wheels were coupled to the crankshaft and wheel slip was limited. Each drive wheel had a clutch, actuated the gear change. Driving wheels also had their own U-joints and shafts, which would allow the front to turn. The front also had independent coil suspension, while the rear axle implemented leaf spring suspension with brakes only on the rear wheels. To say the car was ahead of its time is a drastic understatement. The engine in 1903, though sources conflict, it's believed to be in the neighborhood of 471 cubic inch displacement, which would be about 7.7 liters in line 4 with 5-inch bore and a 6-inch stroke. It was good for 30 horsepower. That is a huge number in 1903. That's also a huge four-cylinder. That four-cylinder is roughly the same displacement as a 472 Cadillac V8. Christie opted for a different type of connecting rod design, X-beam connecting rods, which allowed the pistons to be more offset relative to the crank pin, which in turn allowed for a shorter crankshaft. The crankshaft rides on 3 main bearings. The valve arrangement was F-head design, intake over exhaust, 4 intake valves with small combustion chamber beneath them adjacent to the cylinder. The intake valves were automatic, held closed by a weak spring, and pulled open by vacuum pressure, which was created on the piston's downstroke. Single exhaust valve, which were large, and they were under the intake valves and were mechanically operated, actuated by push rods driven by a camshaft geared by the engine's crankshaft. Single spark plug per cylinder positioned inside the combustion chamber between the exhaust valve and the intake valves. The engine cylinders were cooled by water jackets formed from copper sheets and mounted to cylinder block. The engine used a water pump drawing water from a radiator. The radiator was under the car for better weight distribution. All of that, which brought the weight of the vehicle to an impressive 1,400 pounds. Christie would take the car to Armand Beach, Florida in January of 1904, where Christie averaged an impressive, for the time, 63.1 miles per hour in a 10-mile race. Christie even did a 25-mile endurance race to prove the design concept. But there was issues with lubrication, so Christie would build an all-new design in 1904, similar in design to the inline four, but had a revised valve arrangement, 2 intake valves per cylinder. The new valves were directly above the piston. The intake runners had to be revised as well, with 2 outlets for every 4 set of valves. Bore was also increased to 6.25 inches and stroke was increased to 675 inches. That is also a huge 4-cylinder with 828 cubic inch displacement, 13 liters, and it was good for 70 horsepower, which is an absolutely incredible number for this era. Just for reference, the Wright brothers Flyer engine made 12 horsepower, which was considered high horsepower for this point in time. This engine was on a completely different spectrum. Crankshaft and pistons were made of carbon steel. The crankcase and flywheel was made of manganese bronze alloy. Spark plugs fired from battery-powered coil ignition. The radiator was relocated to the middle of the car for better weight distribution. It was also redesigned in a U shape so air could pass over it instead of through it. The passenger compartment was moved clear to the rear of the car with the gas tank mounted underneath it for better weight distribution. Not much is known about what happened to this concept or even if it raced at all, but towards the end of 1904, Christie was off building an all-new design called the Blue Flyer. The Blue Flyer would use the 70 horsepower engine with a different valve arrangement. Now 36 valves, 4 of which were exhaust. The way the engine was mounted also changed. It's still transverse, but the exhaust valves were towards the rear of the vehicle instead of coming out of the front of the vehicle. The U-shaped radiator was ditched for an all-new design, which had 12 sections. Each section had 8 copper tubes. 340 aluminum fins, which were 5 inches in length, were added. But just like the U-shaped radiator that this design replaced, the air flowed over it, not through it. Christie would race the car on Ormond Beach in January of 1905, covering a mile in 42.2 seconds at a speed of 85.3 miles per hour. The car used 40-inch wheels, so for every rotation of the wheel, the car would travel 10 feet. The car could go 90 miles per hour with the engine turning at only 792 RPM. Christie would win the Lozia Trophy because Christie's car was the only car that lasted the whole 50-mile race. The public were impressed by Christie's car. Christie, seeing this as a possible business venture, a way to make automobiles for sale for the public, he would form Christie Direct Action Motor Car Company. It just kind of rolls off the tongue, does it not? Which was established in 1905 to build passenger cars and race cars. Christie, like most guys who build cars, wanted just a little bit more power, baby. So he put another engine in the 1905 race car, which powered the rear wheels. The car now had 2 engines, all-wheel drive. The second engine was good for 30 horsepower. For a combined 100 horsepower, the twin-engine car made its debut on the 4th of July at Morris Park, New York. The car was difficult to operate and control, but it would cover a mile in 37 seconds at a speed of 97 miles per hour, doing the flying kilometer in 25 seconds at 89.5 miles per hour. In September of that same year, Christie was able to beat his own time on the flying kilometer, 23.25 seconds at 96.2 miles per hour, winning the Cape May Trophy. But in the words of George Harrison, all things must pass. The rear engine would be removed after it failed when trying to beat the record, but Christie would add more radiators to bring the radiator count up to 10. Christie then entered the car in the Vanderbilt Cup race, which was to take place on Long Island, New York on October 14th of that year. George Robertson would be the driver, and to say the car had a bit of a learning curve would be an understatement. Robertson had issues driving for qualification, and he would ultimately wreck the car. The damage was severe. But in a weird change of events, the Cup commissioner removed 3 cars from the race that were already qualified and reinstated 3 cars that didn't qualify. Christie's car was one of the 3 cars given a second chance. Christie worked like hell to get the car ready for the race. Christie decided it would be better for him to drive the car because he knew how to operate it. The first lap, things didn't look all that great, only getting an average speed of 29 miles per hour, but then the engine smoothened out and it was capable of going 56 miles an hour. In the second lap, on the fourth lap, Vinicio Lancia decided to make a pit stop right in front of Christie. Christie tried to avoid collision, but there wasn't enough time or space. Both vehicles collided. Both Lancia and Christie were able to escape with their mechanics with minor injuries. Both cars took on severe damage and were taken out of the contest. Christie would rebuild the 1905 racer with an all-new engine design, still using 4 cylinders, but configured in a V formation. The car would make its debut in January of 1906, but it would crash during qualification. Christie, through his automobile company, built a 7-passenger touring car that had not sold, and not having any other choice, he didn't really want to start completely from scratch. Christie would remove the touring car body. He would build an all-new body to put on the touring car chassis. The engine powering the touring car was very similar in design to the 1903 F-head. Bore was increased to 5.375 inches in a stroke of 7 inches with a displacement of 635 cubic inch displacement, 10.4 liters. It was capable of 50 horsepower, 1200 RPM. Christie didn't really stand much of a chance with half of the horsepower of all the other Vanderbilt Cup cars out there, but he did better than expected, running the race in 7th place. Unfortunately, he couldn't keep that pace for the rest of the race, coming in 13th place out of 18 competitors. Averaging 44.7 miles per hour when the race was called. Not happy with those results, Christie would focus his attention on the V4 engine, selling the touring car tuned race car. Christie wanted a bigger engine. That's why he opted for the V-cylinder configuration. The cylinders were individual and arranged in 2 rows of 2, staggered to keep the engine more compact, angled at 22.5 degrees. The carburetor was placed low behind the engine. Air-fuel mixture traveled through a large pipe to the top center of the engine with manifold attached at the other end. The mixture flowed into each cylinder through a single intake port. It used single exhaust valves, which were 3 and 1 to 5 inches and mechanically operated, opening and closing by rocker arms, which were actuated by push rods. Push rods were camshaft driven from the crankshaft, which was located on the second row of cylinders. Sources conflict on how big or what the engine displacement size was. Perhaps Christie made 2 different versions. One source said that the bore was 7.375 inches in a stroke of 7.35 inches, making it a square engine, and it was a displacement of 1,260 cubic inch displacement, or 20.7 liters, while others give a 7.5 inch bore and a 7-inch stroke, bringing overall displacement to 1,237 cubic inch displacement, or 20.3 liters, making between 100 to 135 horsepower. The crankshaft was made of a chrome steel supported by 3 main bearings. This massive engine was made of lightweight materials, said to have only weighed 470 pounds for the engine, which is absolutely impressive. Christie's V4 racer would first race at Ormond Beach in January of 1906. The car was number 14. The car experienced some teething issues, losing a wheel after hitting debris on the beach during a practice run. The car also experienced cooling issues, leaking water out of the copper water jackets, having to refill the radiator with only 4 miles to go in a 30-mile race. Most people would have thrown in the towel, but Christie went on to finish the race in 37 minutes, 24 seconds, averaging 48.1 miles per hour. The car would turn up in April at Ventnor Beach, New Jersey, sporting an all-new number 4, With a different cooling system, Christie would be able to do a mile in 35.2 seconds at 102.3 miles per hour, which made his car the fastest four-cylinder in the world. In May, Christie took the car to Empire City, New York, lapping the mile track in 53 seconds at 67.9 miles per hour, which tied a record made by Barney Oldfield. By September of 1906, Christie was eyeing up the Vanderbilt Cup again. George Robinson was to drive the car, but he crashed the car during qualifying run on September 15th. Damage wasn't all that bad, so Christie was able to fix the car overnight. But he made a critical error in not looking over the steering arm, which had a small crack in it, which would all come to a head on the morning of September 16th. Christie and his nephew, who was his mechanic, Louis Strang, took the car out on a test run. On acceleration, the steering arm broke. Christie lost control, hitting a telephone pole. The car suffered severe damage. Both Christie and Strang were able to escape uninjured. Christie would begin work on a brand new car. He wanted to show the promise of front-wheel drive to the world, taking all of what he learned from all of his previous engine designs and applied it to the new racer, with the end goal of taking this car to Europe and compete in the French Grand Prix. If Christie was able to make the deadline, he would be the first American to compete in the French Grand Prix. Christie also wanted to expand his automobile company by offering more cars and more designs for sale. You would be forgiven if you think that this car is the same as the 1906 Racer, but the 1907 Racer was a completely new design, going back to a U-shaped inverted radiator design. Passenger compartment was moved to the very rear over the rear axle. The new engine crankcase was cast nickel steel. It also doubled as the front axle, just like all the previous models. Individual steel cylinders were staggered in 2 rows on the crankcase. The cylinders were angled at 45 degrees instead of 22.5 degrees. Each cylinder was covered with a copper water jacket. Cooling water exited the top of each cylinder and flowed through a common radiator. Bore was 7.25 inch and a stroke of 7.25 inch, giving an overall engine displacement of 1,197 cubic inch displacement. V4, 19.6 liters, which made it the largest of any Grand Prix racer before or since. The Fiat Beast of Turin isn't even this big. Was good for anywhere between 100 to 130 horsepower, a big number for its day. Because the cylinders were staggered, it allowed for 2-throw crankshaft. 2 hollow connecting rods were attached to each throw. The crankshaft was supported by 3 main bearings. The steel pistons had concave heads and 5 piston rings, 3 rings above the wrist pin and 2 bronze rings below it. The underside of the piston had cooling fins to help dissipate heat, single spark plugs, and the spark plugs fired on battery-powered coil. Lubrication was both splash and pressurized feed oiler. The car was capable of 120 miles per hour with the engine speed of 1,100 to 1,200 RPM. Christie would test the car driving the streets of Long Island, New York at 4 o'clock in the morning with Louis Strang riding as mechanic, breaking down only after 20 miles. Once the car was fixed, the racer had cowling, but due to cooling issues, the cowling would be removed. In June, the trio, Christie, Strang, and the V4 racer, left for France. 38 cars entered the French Grand Prix. The race was only 10 laps with 47.8 mile course. The race was held on July 2nd of 1907. The Christie racer was the lightest and the most powerful one on the track. Christie started in the middle of the field, about 12th place, starting the race at 6:12 in the morning. Not the butt crack of dawn, but pretty close. Things didn't start off great, with engine issues, particularly sticking valves. The problem was compounded when the clutch jammed and cooling issues began to appear. By the 5th lap, Christie was out of the race. When he returned to the States, he was mocked and ridiculed for the car's poor performance. Christie would counter to the critics, saying that at least he had the balls to put up his own money on this venture, something that people criticizing him couldn't do or didn't do. And he would challenge the critics to any race for any amount of money. Good for him. Critics, most of the time, don't have a freaking clue the struggles that are involved. And they just don't have the balls to take the risks, but they can sit there behind a computer desk and criticize you. Know-it-alls in fields that they are totally foreign to, just like keyboard warriors of today. No one took Christie's challenge. Christie and Strang would run the car at various events. In August, the car ran a 52.2-second mile at 69 miles per hour on a dirt track in Morris Park, New York. On September 9th, they were on a track in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where they struck a wrecked racer. Strang was uninjured, but Christie was rushed to hospital with multiple injuries, broken wrists, sprained back, lacerated head, and injuries to his abdomen. The V4 racer was repaired. Christie and Strang took it to Birmingham, Alabama, and then New Orleans, Louisiana. Christie was still recovering, and he didn't drive all that much. Christie would send the car back to New York, but Strang had other plans and ran the car at various events without Christie's consent, which ended their partnership. In 1908, Christie would build another V4 racer, which would be his last. Even though it was a V4 power plant, it was a completely different design. The cylinders were angled 8 degrees from horizontal. The first row of cylinders were angled at 20 degrees from the rear row of cylinders, slanted back for both weight distribution and aerodynamics. The crankshaft was forged steel, 2 throws supported by 2 main bearings, articulated connecting rods which served the front row of upper cylinders. Bore was 7.5 inches with a stroke of 7 inches, which gave an engine displacement of 1,237 cubic inch displacement, 20.3 liters. Sources vary on power output, but it's believed that this engine made anywhere between 100 to 300 horsepower, probably somewhere in the center. Intake and exhaust ports were now the same size, 3 inches. The racer would run with different tire sizes, 30-inch for circle tracks, 32-inch tires for road use, and 34-inch tires for high speed. The racer could go 130 miles per hour with 34-inch tires, with the engine speed turning only at 1,285 RPM. The racer would make its public debut on July 8th of 1909, Blue Bonnets Track, Montreal, Canada. The car didn't perform as well as Christie had hoped for. Engine problems were prevalent. He did run a 59.6 second mile at 60.4 miles per hour. Christie's car caught on fire in the second race, which took him out of the contest. He ran at other events with varying success, but always came with problems. In mid-December, Christie ran a half a mile at Indy at 17.53 seconds at 102.7 miles per hour. George Robinson was hired to drive the Christine V4 racer at Ormond Beach in March of 1910. The car had an aero body with front and rear cowling. Passenger seat was completely removed. The racer ran 32.6 second mile at 111.2 miles per hour, but it couldn't approach the 27.33 second mile at 131.7 miles per hour set by Barney Oldfield. Robinson went out to try again, but the car decided to overheat and seize. Once the engine seized, the drive wheels froze and it slid along the sand, destroying the tires and damaging the front wheels. The racer was resurrected once more, but experienced other problems. Christie, out of frustration, just said, "I'm done with this." He exited the racing and the automotive business entirely. Oldfield bought the V4 racer for $750 in 1912 or $24,855 in the year 2025, and he would race the car for at least 4 years, setting various records with it. Oldfield would sell the car after damaging it in 1916. Then it was sold again in 1918 to a racer, Louis Disbrow, and then it was sold to scrap in 1919. Christie would go on to aviation, fire trucks, and then building various tank parts with various tank suspensions, which we will get into another day in different episodes. But as the years went on, money faded. Once telling a friend that it's no shame being poor, but it's a damn inconvenience, Christie would die in 1944 broke. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I have no idea why this guy gets lost to time. He should be up there with W.O. Bentley, Duesenberg brothers, Bugatti, in my opinion, and he's just a footnote in history. And I never asked this, but if you could, please share this episode. This guy needs to be remembered for his innovations. Even though they wasn't all that successful, he was and is the father of front-wheel drive. No would you rather today, because I'm pretty sure all of you guys would rather have some sort of V4 racer. I mean, it's a really cool looking car. But we are going to do Name That Tune. First person to give both the name of the band, song title, and the song lyric that comes next. You need all three to have your comment pinned to the top of the comment section. Don't know if words could say, darling, I'll find a way. So just to reiterate, I need all three. I need the next line after what I sang and the name of the band and song title to have your comment pinned to the top of the comment section. Thank you all so much for coming out and watching this one. If you'd like to get in touch with me, shoot me a comment in the comment section below. I read and answer all comments posted. I don't say that for self-worth. I say that because a lot of YouTubers, they don't care about their audience. I'm different. I do. I care very much about this community because it's something I worked very hard on building, and I just like being a part of it, and it will always be that way. It's something that I really like doing. Thanks again for everything that you guys bring, and until next time, toodaloo!